I'm lying in bed, trying to recuperate from my what some people call poisoning.
How are you doing today? He's recuperating in bed.
Days that started off good, but by about 3 o'clock, I started to feel the need to lie down and wait out the pain.
You're still getting about 3 or 4 hours before it kicks in stronger?
Yeah.
Was it something that has to kind of bleed out of your system or drain out of your system?
Well, from what I have been told, it is linked to a pesticide which normally over the last few years is used to grow corn. Apparently there is a gene that has been modified within corn to make it grow in larger quantities, but that gene is affected somehow by a certain pesticide they've developed to go along with it, and if it's sprayed widely before planting, is what I understand, then it attacks the nervous system. Pests included in that pests, the corn, they are present, are bee populations. Have been referring to a situation recently called colony collapse, where bees are dying by the billions. Of course, the chemistry crowd that manufacture this genetic engineered corn care more about their results than anybody else's. So if it affects bees, it doesn't really bother them. Now, how it got into my system is a question which is still to be resolved. The cell I know has been investigating, and they are looking into the possibility that our next door neighbors who've recently acquired control over the farmland around us and who in their first year cleaned off the property next door to us, leveled it all off, and then collected the stones and laid down a crop of peas of some kind, whether they're really peas or some other derivative. Apparently there's been studies, genetic engineering studies on these crops that could be soya bean related. In New Zealand is where they've done the testing. They had that in the ground for the first year. Then the second year, which was last year, they leveled the ground and inserted water irrigation pipes and put in corn. And it's thought that irrigation was a means for spreading this pesticide. This, of course, family next door to us is known as, their family name is Snowden. They are linked to the royal family of England. Princess Margaret, the Queen's sister, had been married to a photographer by the name of Snowden. In Montreal, there is a district just west of center called Snowden, and it's linked to the families of Europe that control royalties. So that may have been reason for an increase in this pesticide being in the neighborhood, plus the fact that if there are trucks going by all the time, this pesticide in them in the spring can have a buildup. But there is another consideration. Farm that it was pre-designed for just this purpose. At this time, you guys have seen that the situation that existed in the basement of the house is one that brings a flow of water into the sump pump. We have to pump it out of the basement back on the surface because it happens year-round practically. It could be that someone is adding this pesticide as it flows by their place. Then it comes into the house and has an effect on the kitchen corner, which is the northeast corner of the house, lying on the ground. Even in the middle of winter, water flows there, can be 25 below zero, and there you are pumping water out of the basement onto the ice out there. But the layout seems to be such as to affect a narrow band of land, which is between two sets of pine trees, spruce pine trees, leading back from the house all the way to the barn. Since I've been on the property, I've had the occasion on probably 3 or 4 times, apart from this one, having eruptions, what almost seems as a nerve gas that affects nervous system in a manner that basically makes it difficult for you to lift a leg or lift an arm up in the air. Hands go numb, your wrists hurt, get a band of pain across the biceps, shoulders, neck. Lifting, you can have one sore hip one day and it'd be perfectly well the next day, while the opposite hip has all of a sudden gone crazy on you, or left wrist stops hurting one day and the right wrist begins to hurt. So it's jumping around the body from day to day. When we were called, Jennifer and I, to go to Montreal for the refugee hearing, told them that we had animals to take care of here, and it didn't make sense that someone should be asked to go to Montreal when the headquarters of the immigration department is in Ottawa, and Ottawa is basically 50 miles from here, and Montreal is 150 miles or more from here. But they insisted that we go there. And when we went on March the 4th, there was an understanding that it was not the right thing for us to do, to have to go to Montreal. And finally, the judge decided that they needed to hear the bigger story of what Jennifer and I have been talking about, which is goes back before the Ice Age, includes the evolution of trees and memory, and the evolution of memory in human beings since then. And it was suggested by me that that would take approximately 4 sessions of about an hour and a half in order to go through the entire thing, and that I couldn't leave Ontario to go to Quebec 4 days in a row. So they arranged for us to have a meeting in June 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th, where we would go to the Ottawa office and they would have a video teleconference with Montreal from there. While we were in Montreal, I asked them what they intended to do for Jennifer, because she's in Canada as a refugee because of what they tried to do to her in Ogdensburg. And the judge said he wasn't aware of the details, that he couldn't answer those questions. I'd have to go somewhere else. In the meantime, we found out that all refugees that come to Canada are placed on kind of a welfare ticket, as with other people on welfare, and they have a basic monthly income on which to survive. She has received nothing. And in trying to identify who's responsible for it, you can't get through to anybody. So we came back to begin the process of waiting out the period from March the 4th to June 17th with no money, which meant, of course, that Jennifer couldn't pay her car insurance. And while we were here, we were noticing that people were playing, I don't know when, at night or whenever, with our vehicles. Now we've had a visit from the police to say that because she has no insurance, she can't drive her car here, which will make it difficult to attend any sessions in Ottawa. And they seem to have been involved, and I'm talking about from information received from the cell. The Ontario Provincial Police seem to be involved with tampering with our vehicles, tampering along with our neighbors, providing support for unannounced and untold visits to the house and farm, tampering with the laundry equipment and that kind of stuff. And now we have the additional burden of having to deal with this pesticide that is either being sent in through the sump pump or by some other means. And they had the crop of corn there last year, but I don't know what they're planning this year because I haven't seen anything grow there yet. Now, all of this is seemingly part of a bigger plan associated to what we've been talking about, the Lou at the Sioux. When the flood comes, there are basically two floods. There's the water flood that comes and destroys things in its way and turns the plate of the earth into nova. But there is also the other aspect, which is it raises gases out of the ground, and you get what they call a dry flood of gas that will flow from this area towards Ottawa. The intent, I guess, is to make room for civil servants who will have to migrate from the U.S. and take over positions in government in Ottawa. We've seen that the national capital of Ottawa over the last few years has been amalgamated to the point where the farm area around Ottawa, now included into the city of Ottawa, has now made it the largest footprint for a capital anywhere in the world. So obviously they're awaiting the arrival of a large number of Americans as soon as the Lou at the Sioux begins to occupy land in this area. They're also building at high speed one of the largest shopping centers you could find in a rural area, including people like Staples and Walmart and other big American companies are setting up in Canada here. So what the purpose is of what they're doing here, precisely what they're doing in this place, is somewhat in question, but it is and always has been suggested by Norse mythology that at the end times the northern hemisphere must be destroyed. 1,000 years later, the southern hemisphere, and then a waiting period for the passing of a new North Star called Alderamin. That there are to be, and there hasn't been, from what we understand, since the Ice Age, any real independent human birthing activity, but rather all of the birthing is being manipulated since the 18th dynasty in Egypt, which is somewhere around 1500 BC. And human beings are being raised like cattle, genetically engineered prior to birth, task-oriented in that genetic engineering, and then added into the existing populations in numbers that over time take over the genetics of any group, and is the reason why they use the word country for a specific genetic group of people. The word country, of course, you know that if you take the O from the front and you put it in the back, the tree, T-R-Y, becomes Troy, and the front part becomes cunt, and that's one of the ways they have of hiding and laughing at us over the things they're doing, and that it is intended that there will be a final war called Ragnarok, made up of reanimated human beings who have proved themselves to be the best soldiers on the battlefield. You'll remember that China has been unearthing what they call an army of clay soldiers, which each individual, and there are thousands of them, has a different appearance, facial appearance, body size, and whatever. And that they are the replica of the genetically engineered soldier at the end time that will be reanimated for the planet, and that there has to be an equivalent army constructed in the West. Well, we now know that genetic engineering has been introduced into secret religions based upon ecclesiastic Freemasonry from at least the time of Hatshepsut in the 18th dynasty. A woman who wore a phony beard and ruled as regent over Egypt, even though it was illegal for anyone but a male to be in charge. And that activity was repeated 100 years later by a male and a female called Ai and Tai, who ran basically the harem for the pharaoh, from which were born Akhenaten, whose name basically is linked to that. The existing priesthood of the day was Amen, and he was Akhen A10, which said that so many changes down the road, they would have the species that they call human modified to their rules and regulations. And Akhenaten's grandparents, of course, were linked to a Egyptian family called Tutmosis. And he basically left Egypt with a formula for genetic engineering human beings under the name of Moses, and brought it to Jordan, from where they waited out the 40 years necessary for people in those days to die off, so that nobody would have the knowledge of the connection. Then moved in under King Saul to create out of Palestine a state called Israel. And Israel's name was derived from the wife of the first family that left Media in Iran to go to Palestine to begin a new religion. The wife of the family was Isra. If you add the pronoun le, as you do in French for the, that makes Israel. Snowden family has its origin in Israel as well. So this entire area, I am told, is to be divided into three parts. One place where the soldiers who will fight the war on behalf of the West will be animated. The meeting place in the center, and in the east, as the bodies are produced on the western side by nuns, the soldiers will take their place. If you look at the map and look for an area called Morrisburg in Ontario, just between us and the Quebec border, that's where the war is supposed to take place. Now, if during a war one were to use a dry flood, you could in fact kill off the two armies, which is basically what they did in the 18th dynasty with Tutankhamun and his brothers Menkaure, who fought each other to the death so that the genetic engineers, Ai and Tai, could in fact take over. Exactly what they did. So we are probably, Jennifer and I, here at this time as guinea pigs. And they are running the scenario past us to see how we act and react. Jennifer also has a case of this nerve agent disease, but because she's been here only a matter of months, and I've been here for years, the intensity is different. I'm trying to affect our ability to survive or do things that are being asked of us to do. It seems to be the goal behind all of this. And it's heading for a point which I suggest is John the Baptist Day, June 24th. John the Baptist, as you know, was decapitated at the will of the king. Not because he wanted to do it, but because it was a request made from him, made of him by his wife and her daughter. St. John the Baptist is the patron saint of the province of Quebec. I'm 71 years old now, and I lived on the border of the province of Quebec in Ottawa, and could never understand how come in our region of Ontario the average family size was 3 or 4. But in Quebec, the average family size was 10, 12, 15, 20 children. And I had trouble trying to figure out how a family can exist with that many children, and where did they come from? Because making 20 kids in each family or 15 kids in each family seemed to be an awful burden on a couple. But now that I understand that the children they physically made were only a fraction of that, and the absorption into the family of a number of manufactured children, manufactured by the nuns at the local monastery, would explain what was going on. And that by manufacturing task-oriented children and inserting them into families and providing them an income on which to live would make it something that would interest the parents. Catholic families seem to have repeated that process. Western Canada and down into the United States, Montana, Oregon, into California. So, if you genetically engineer a race by introducing into it a number of people you have task-oriented and manufactured to take it over, these people who come in, of course, pass down their gene pool on a 4-generational basis, which means 80 to 100 years of descendants from these manufactured people. And it's easy enough to spot, since most of these factories were centered around prison colonies, that personality was important to the people who were genetically engineering people. And that if in your prison you had 100 rapists or 100 mass murderers sent from all over the world, as they did in Ogdensburg, New York, and later moved to Australia, it would be fairly simple for the engineers to figure out which gene needed to be input into the individual they were making to replicate its personality, make it a psychopath, make it a mass murderer or a sexual predator. But these are the exceptions, I suggest, to the rule. The majority of the population was basically too smart. I'm not talking about intelligent now. I'm talking about people who can think on their feet rather than obtain the information from a book. And they needed these smart people to develop a space program. But if you're going to make a race, there are too many of them that are not involved directly in making the space program. And they become a problem to the master because they don't basically listen to what they're being ordered to do without prior discussion. So dumbing down is one feature that was applied in search of mediocrity. And a dumbed down, mediocre race makes a great bureaucracy. People who, for personal gain, will follow instructions without question. One doesn't have to look too far outside of New York State, Ontario, and Quebec to come to the conclusion that this was the center activity that led to the creation of a bureaucracy. State bureaucracy in New York, which was planned in Massachusetts and tracked in Maryland, was created in the center point between Quebec, New York State, and Ontario. And these are the people who are in charge today. Now, all of this stuff had its origin before the Ice Age. And it all has a very defined process by which it evolved. You know, the eldest trees being as old as 80 million years collect information. They do it in a ring because the tree is basically static and can only record information which goes by it, such as which summer was warm, which winter was really cold, if there was a lot of rain. All of that stuff is recorded in a tree. It takes water from the ground, reanimates the tree, just as if you were reanimating a human being. It collects energy and information through the branches and the leaves, and then returns the information to the land. And when it does, the leaves change color, dry up, and fall off. Human beings are not much different than the tree and the animals, dinosaurs, and whatever that lived in between 80 million years ago and today, except for one thing. They, in fact, are in motion. Human beings, like all animals, are born in one place, but don't necessarily stay in that one place. They collect information in their region and eventually end up wanderers across the countries of the world, collecting information. So memory is at the heart of all of what we're learning, and the reason why the company that manufactured the BlackBerry is called Research in Motion. They changed their name recently, but RIM, which Mir in Russian means child or son, is basically what they were all about. They were about building trees that would gather information at a further distance than the place they were born in. And in order to do that with human beings, of course, you use the tools called war, pestilence, famine, and disease to cause people to pack up en masse as a group and leave the place they were born and go to another region in which they will then bring with them their genetic pool. And of course you saw that happening when Arabs went through Africa, collecting black people, putting them on boats and shipping them across to the West, where they would be the slaves of white people. And of course the master, who has the gene of a sexual predator, will move some of its gene pool into the black population. And contrary, the black population used as slaves and going into the homes of white people will do the opposite from a place called a harem, or in New York State, Harlem. So there is a kind of a consensual discontent going on all the time, with groups of people being moved from one place where they were manufactured to another place where their personality traits are needed to infest or infect, whatever you want to call it, another group of manufactured people and change the totality of their gene pool. And that's what we have seen develop over the years. To go into all of the details of that which we've collected with the help of the cell over the last 4 or 5 years would, as I told the government, take a minimum of 1.5 hour sessions 4 times. And unless it's recorded, no one will ever remember all of it, because it's been designed that our brain is able to listen to something for about 45 minutes, and then we start losing touch with what is being spoken. But that's the general picture that we're seeing now, is that Dr. Wilder Penfield was an American neurologist from, I believe, Washington State originally. And he was studying memory. And he was trying to figure out, and by the way, Wilder is a code word, Penfield is another combined code word. So he was genetically engineered for this particular task. And he went to New York to attempt to get funding for an experiment that he wanted to carry out. Ended up in giving details about what he wanted to do in a laboratory to study how memory really works, and was denied support by the U.S. government because it was considered to be inhuman or tampering with the laws of creation, and was unable to proceed there, but out stepped the Rockefeller family, and they agreed to support his research, but he would have to move to Montreal to be outside of the border of the United States. And he did so, and at McGill University in Montreal created the Montreal Neurological Institute, from where he proceeded to do his investigations. The main end result of his investigations were that in open head surgery, he was able to prove to anybody who was standing by and watching that the brain functioned in a fairly simple way. It basically recorded in what is known as the pineal gland, it recorded the information in what appeared to be a frame-by-frame process, gathering up all of the information from the day one was born to the day one died. One would discover along the way that some of the things that were being learned were traumatic to the extent that it would debilitate the individual from normal daily life. And when that occurred, a compartment was opened up. That memory was moved to the compartment, and it was shipped into the subconscious. But that in opening up the brain to his manipulations, he was able to demonstrate that you could, in fact, turn memory back, or as one would see on a tape deck, fast forward or at slow speed, minute by minute, and wherever he stopped, the individual on the operating table would not only recount an event that had occurred, but would relive it. It would be more like a videotape, an audio tape combined of the event, than just a memory of the event. And he could basically move it back, and if there was a gap, know that that could be retrieved from the subconscious. All of this being done by the in-between brain, which sits someplace above the spinal column and below the brain itself, and could in fact play with the individual by tapping on the brain to move the story backwards or forwards in its memory. One of the things he also discovered was that the brain did not keep its entire memory in one place, physically speaking. That if a person was injured and a part of the brain was destroyed, the memories were lost. However, over time that followed the injury, that memory was regained into a different portion of the brain, which suggested to him that there was a storage place outside the head where information was being backed up, much like a computer uses a hard drive and then a flash drive or whatever to make information that was primarily in the brain portable should something happen to the hard drive. So memory, after all, the computer is designed on human beings, and it's from these lessons on the human body that people built computers. So with all of that information provided to him, he concluded that the backup were the memories on human beings, and the glands located within the region of the memories. And of course, the word memory is made up of two parts. Mam, most ancient matron, so the original clan mothers of Africa. And memory is basically where the information is stored. And as soon as the brain is no longer ill, even though a part of it has been destroyed, there is a call-up and a downloading or uploading to the brain from the memory in the memory. That basically, making a long story short, is what he concluded was how human beings worked. And he got from the scientific community clash of opinions, which basically suggested that his patients, the human beings he had on a slab in front of him during these open-head operations, may not be telling the truth, that they may be inventing stories as they go along, that he had no way of confirming that what they were saying had actually occurred, and concluded that the only way around that situation would be to genetically engineer with certain talents, art, both dance and on paper, and lifestyle, social engineering, would have to be orchestrated in a trial model from beginning to end. And that would mean you would have to manufacture a baby in a nunnery, hand that baby to a known family, have that baby involved in ritualistic stress on very specific occasions during its entire lifetime. In other words, as a baby, the parents must, on a very specific day, very specific date, abuse that child, physically and or sexually. That as life proceeded, that abuse would be transferred to babysitters, and later on to teachers, and from teachers to friends, and from friends to kidnappers, from kidnappers to the medical profession, doctors, psychiatrists, therapists, and that's why they call them therapists, the rapists. And under each circumstances, records would be kept, detailed records would be kept. Our belief is that in 1955, just following his retirement, Dr. Wilder Penfield started tracking a child. The parents were being paid a fee, and the parents were told where to live. And the child was born in Ogdensburg, which in 1867 had been described by the New York Times as Ogdensburg, Canada. That somebody on purpose, following the Ogdensburg Agreement, drew the border between Canada and the United States slightly to the north of where it should have been, and therefore put Ogdensburg into the U.S. And that forced the baby makers, the Grey Nuns of Montreal and Ottawa, to move in 1869 to Ogdensburg. And for 100 years thereafter made babies from the prison colony that existed underground along the seaway, and the prisons that were placed in northern New York, where the system wanted to get prisoners away from the principal cities. And the building of the canal, Erie Canal, made it quite easy to put somebody on a barge in New York City and send them up to Troy, and then across and disembark and put them in a prison in Ogdensburg, from which babies were made. If you look at a newspaper, 1955, there's a story there about the Grey Nuns having a garage sale type of thing, except what they were distributing was free of charge, and they were babies. And hundreds, 200-300 babies laid out in cribs on the top floor of what was the monastery. A cone vent is what they call it. And people were invited from all over the United States to come to Ogdensburg and pick out a child. It would be free, however, it would have no papers. But yet they were advised that once they got back to their region, they simply had to call the bishop or equivalent in other religions, who would give them a birth certificate and later on a baptismal or whatever certificate was needed by that religion. One of the children born in 1955 that went to a family who took it into Montana was Jennifer. And their family grew to have 4 girls. But Jennifer was never treated in the same way as the other girls. Special treatment for her, not necessarily positive, actually negative in the most part. But it simply followed upon the ritualistic activity that the parents were charged with. And eventually, the father, both were teachers, mother and father. The father was chased out of Montana for what seems to be associated to child abuse. And they took up their living space in Southern California, Anaheim, to be exact, right where the abuser of children called Walt Disney set up Disneyland. That allows for a lot of parents with similar children to bring them to a central location, send them to Disneyland while they attend classes on how to advance the cause of the system. And close to the largest U.S. Navy bases in the Pacific, who in fact took care of some of the kidnapping these children and ritual abuse into their adulthood. Everything recorded from 1955 on becomes part of the record in a hospital. And from the hospital, federal laws are imposed upon local hospitals, and reporting has to be done to a central place on how the patients came in and what their problems were and the overall experience they had in the time they were in the hospital. But then the next step comes in where the federal government orders different reporting structures that meet other requirements than the one of getting the patient better. And those reports are stored on and worked on in Maryland, which, by the way, just happens to be the headquarters of the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy is not, of course, something that just popped out of the ground and became mariners. They are descendants of all navies before them. Because how else could a country send people to another country en masse without ships? And if you go back in time, they basically were known as Phoenicians. Phoenicians, Phoenicians at the end is linked to Cain, the builder. Phonetics is the first part of the word, which meant that they could deal with many different populations that they would plant all over the world with a different language, but the phonetics of the language and the pictographs of the writing, they would know. And every time you see a picture of someone arriving from Spain or Portugal to a new country, the guy standing next to him is a priest. And he would decipher what the people who were already there knew and teach languages to the people they were bringing, who would be inserted into the gene pool. So in other words, the period in time between the Ice Age, the last or fourth Ice Age, which you're writing down numbers, would be 24,000 BC to about 8,000 BC, period of 16,000 years. That's the marker between the original people who were first evolved through creation from the trees, the plants, the other animals, by the combination of genetic material sent to Earth from outside the solar system by the arrival of comets. And over the millions of years, the evolution is basically a chance coming together of all of the parts under the right conditions would in fact create a new version of trees or a new version of animals, for example, the dinosaur, and then a newer version of animals such as the human being. Once the lesson is taught, that dinosaur may be the biggest animal in the world, but it also is the dumbest and is not needed for the purpose that the system has in mind of creating a mind that walks and is in motion. So some material arrives by comet which causes the destruction of the existing ruling race of animals, and others lay down the foundation for the genetics needed for smaller but smarter animal called human. And over the period of approximately 130,000 BC to 80,000 BC, about 50,000 years, humans lived as they were made. Unfortunately, for most of them, what ended up becoming males were in one place, and those that ended up being female were in a different place, separated by, say, the Mediterranean Sea and the mountains of Europe. And it wasn't until about 80,000 BC where they came together. When they came together and had sexual relations, they began to understand the process through which genetic engineering could evolve. And what evolved is evolution, which basically means the taking away of the intended process of creation and transferring it to a group of people who claimed the rights of creation and called itself God, linked to the word dog backwards, dogs and bitches. And they worked out the process between 80,000 BC and 60,000 BC. They worked out a process by which they could make babies and understand what was happening and what role the male played, what role the female played. The babies born that were male went with the Neanderthalers. The babies born that were female went with the women who were later called Amazons from North Africa. And until they fought, they were learning. But as they learned and developed archives, one group and then the other felt that they were the principal partner in the deal, and they didn't need the other one's assistance if they, in fact, decided to genetically engineer their own. So the males basically sacrificed females to steal their eggs, while the females gathered sperm from the males and put it in some kind of lab, and each one had some of each of the other and went back to doing their own thing for a period of a couple of thousand years. At one stage of the game, the male side of things, Neanderthalers, lost a large number of people in a landslide of snow called an avalanche. And in an avalanche, there's kind of instant death in a matter of minutes, followed by instant freezing. If you remember some of the things we talked about before, if a person or an animal dies in other than freezing conditions, the spot on the ground where they died will change colors. The place you bury them will also change colors. So there seems to be a kind of a two-step process, three-step really, because first there's death. Second is immediate loss of life energy that is absorbed by the grass around it and changes its color. And later, as the whole body has been consumed, a final loss of life energy usually will change the color of the grass at the place the body was buried. So there appears to be a three-step process in birthing. One, you need an egg, real egg from a real woman, or genetically engineered, which means basically you open it up, take out what's in it, and put in what you want instead. The next thing is the fertilization of that egg. And the third thing is the addition of life force in a step-by-step process, which with human beings takes 9 months, developing a fetus from beginning to end. And that can only be done, they were to discover, if the fertilized egg was in a sac containing a liquid which resembles water, amniotic fluid, which just basically means water that's had additions to it. And the lesson was taught to the Neanderthaler when they would retrieve some of the people who had died in the avalanche and put them in a place to melt them down and find out that he basically died again. And that was the end of it. Somebody had the idea that you had to slow down the thawing process, and they put them in a room where they could control the temperature and drop it slowly, and found out that there wasn't much difference from doing it quickly if it was done in a room. And it was suggested then that maybe a vase of some kind, transparent vase that they could look at, fill with water, seawater, would in fact bring this to life. By the way, salt in any recipe has not only the ability to give you a salty taste, but sodium enhances the flavor of everything else that's been put in the recipe. So, in all, they made a solution using the sap of trees that bore fruit as a basis instead of straight seawater. Mix the two of them together and watch the meltdown of the original person, and then pulled him out, seeing the bubbling or whatever effect, change in color of the liquid, and then put the fertilized egg in there and saw how it interacted with the egg and caused a new birth. There is a suggestion that at one stage of the game, the fetus could be taken out and inserted into an animal to be carried to term. The animal suggested is a sea cow, manatee, that kind of animal, whale, which is linked to the word male. In any event, they found out that you can, in fact, reanimate the DNA of one person from the egg and the sperm if it's properly done in a laboratory. And that was the lesson learned in the 18th dynasty, which was given to them from the people who had developed prior to the Ice Age. So the reason for the period in time we're in, which is 8000 BC forward to about 8000 AD, is basically a laboratory. The people before the Ice Age who used the technology they had developed to master the race, very well known in secret societies as ascended masters. They, in fact, passed down the information secretly, known only by two separate groups, one male, one female, and called themselves ecclesiastic Freemasonry, and hide behind the scene to manage everything in this period of time, the 16,000 years, which is the time we are now at 10,000 years. Akhenaten 10. So now we've done what we were sent to do. We grew from a few 100,000 people, genetically assisted, to 7 billion people. We know by the writings of the writers of the 1500s, when the Bible was written and the New Atlantis was written, that they consider the period of time 4000 BC to 2000 AD to be known as the College of 6 days, one day being 1,000 years. So that's where the story of making a woman from Adam's rib, Eve, is the woman that was made, which basically tells you right off, this isn't going to be the last version. This is the penultimate version, Eve, women. And over the period of the last 6,000 years, we have accomplished everything they were looking for. One thing they were looking for was to be able to test on a large enough group of people war, pestilence, famine, and disease. Unless you have a large enough number of people to do it with, you can't be sure of the end result. Now they are. Another thing they've learned is that you can make anything you want in a task-specific world. You can make people who are smart, you can make people who are not smart, you can make all kinds of people who consider themselves masters. You can make people who consider themselves destroyers. All of these things are all possible. They've done it. Now the time has come where the information they've gathered has to be assembled and retested without the interference of those who did the original investigations. Most of the original investigations were done in the Northern Hemisphere. Northern Hemisphere contains 6 billion people. Southern Hemisphere, 1 billion people. From the 6 billion people, you have to go through a process of mass destruction to eliminate as many as you can, leaving 1 billion in the Southern Hemisphere, which basically means South America, South Africa, not the country, but the location, and Australia, New Zealand. That gives you 3 and 1, 13, like 2013. They are awaiting there the opportunity to begin the process of reviewing the papers, reviewing the archives. And for that purpose, the money that had been sent from the West, the surplus money that had been sent from the West and turned into gold and made part of Hindu society, is now being transferred to Brazil. They will have the same task in Brazil as India had during our period here. The journey of the money is basically symbolized by the movement of the Orange Lodge, leading to merging with the nuns, gray nuns, blue nuns. There's all kinds of nuns, but they all have the same purpose, and that's to have God's children, place them out into society. So a symbol had to be created for this, and it's known in the world as the Jewish Holocaust. We are now told the intent was to destroy the Jewish people by Nazis in Germany. But if you know the history of Germany, the people there came from Israel during the diaspora and set up the biggest Jewish state in Germany that was in place until the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s. So it's kind of like a civil war. They changed religion for the purpose of doing what they had to do, and to disguise what they had to do, and to enhance the memory of why they did what they did. They began by gathering Roma, gypsies, and assembled them in concentration camps. Then they followed by gays, and then by Masons, and finally turned their attention to Jews. And the total number killed is not coincidental, but basically based upon a college of 6 days. Instead of 6 billion, the first gang is 6 million. And it all happened in a period prior to the reanimation of the State of Israel in 1949, 49 being a 13. The same border was applied between the United States and Canada, 49th parallel. Not by accident, all basically confirmation of where they sit with their plan at any specific time. Along the way of manufacturing people the way they did, they discovered that the fluid, the amniotic fluid in which the babies were born, had an effect on what we call personality, what the medical profession calls humor. And it was by trial and error that they tested different fruit trees as a mixture that could be added during the genetic engineering of the fetus. Went through the process of palm trees, coconut, for example, and into fig trees and plum trees, and orange seems to be a very helpful fruit to use, so it basically was sent from India to China, back to India, and then distributed step by step all over the world. And the latest one to receive from Japan, the orange, after it has traveled all across Europe and North Africa to America and across to Japan, is now in Brazil. Brazil is the largest distributor of oranges in the world. However, they did find by accident while they were in Montreal, Canada, that there was something in the water coming from the St. Lawrence that seemed to be better than fruit juice. In other words, when you make a fruit, you lose some of the quality of the sap. And therefore, what they had discovered 2,000 years before was that there was a tree in Canada, mostly in Quebec and Ontario, some in the northern United States, but mostly in Quebec and Ontario, that in fact made no fruit in the common sense of a peach, or the latest one they had been using was the apple, and that's where the story of Johnny Appleseed bringing apple seeds to create an orchard and a Bible to read, and the two of them together will tell you what your true mission in life is, and that's to make babies for God who follow the instructions set into their DNA. But that the maple tree, which is kind of a version of the apple tree, but more female than male. The word apple, of course, starts with APP, which is from the word pap. Everybody knows what a pap smear is and what it's all about. In the original sense of the word pap was the breast, because the breast feeds, it nurtures, and that's why the name Pope at the Vatican is the English version of the French word pap, which comes from Latin. So the mother seed, as opposed to the father seed, is more likely to be closer to what they are looking for. They call Ogdensburg the Maple City. They also have drawn through the layout of their streets a fish, a salmon, as part of their map. So there's a context there of salmon going home to spawn. They turn red and die. Maple goes home to create leaves and move sugar. That's why they call them sugar maples. And then at the end of the season, out drops the sap, and the leaves turn red where there's been the most sugar, and fall off the tree and wait for another season. Spring, of course, those who make maple syrup will gather up the sap as it's rising on those nights that are very cold at night but sunny in the morning, causes the sap to rise, and they kind of hijack a portion of it and then filter it. The filtering of sap, it takes a lot of sap, about 1,000 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup, which makes it kind of strange as to why people would go to that much trouble. In any event, they do, and much of what is made in the way of maple syrup, the high-quality stuff, is put into warehouses, and for whatever reason, not much of it gets on the market. Only the darker stuff that has more bark taste ends up on the market for sale. Recently, there's been a hijacking. Somebody broke in and stole thousands of tons of maple syrup from a warehouse in Quebec. And you don't know where it's going, but I can probably vouch that it's in some genetic engineering lab someplace. In any event, we go through that stuff every year. If you go back in time, there is a time where a group of people who, in ancient times before the Ice Age, were known as the Golden Hordes. Those are basically people who came from the Himalayas, set up in the Caucasus Mountains, had a group of descendants which are known as Caucasians. These first batch of Caucasians were white, blonde hair, and moved into Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Finland, and Russia, mostly. Finland is the only country that has kind of kept immigrants from migrating there. That's why they call them Finnish. Therefore, they have a very distinctive genome linked to Caucasians. But if you study the Finns, you'll find out that there are two versions of Caucasians. Second version had to be created because the first version was too linked to Asia, and they wanted a milder version for what they wanted to do in America. That's linked to the maple. Since it's linked to the maple, that Ontario and Quebec sit along the edges of the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, and stuff normally pours down rather than up. If you consider that what is called the Bruce Peninsula of Ontario, which is, say, from Trenton, Ontario, or Peterborough, going west, it takes in the edges of Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, Lake St. Clair, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, and ends just before Lake Superior. That most of the maple trees that produce sap, maple sap, sweet sap, grow in an area that will then flow into the Great Lakes, mostly Lake Superior. And since the Great Lakes are laid out something like a check mark, like the Nike, even though they appear on a map to be going south and then north, it's always going down towards the sea. It wouldn't flow that way. But the version up to Montreal and even Ogdensburg of the flow of the water there is basically two-directional. Middle is flowing south towards the Atlantic Ocean, so it looks north on the map.